Welcome to the Binge Dietitian podcast. I'm your host, Jonathan Sumner, registered dietitian, focusing on helping men and women end binge eating, end food guilt, and finally say yes to life. This podcast is for educational and informational purposes only. It is not substitute for medical and personalized advice. Hi, welcome to this episode of the Binge Dietitian podcast. In this episode, we'll talk about the difference between emotional eating and binge eating. So, to get straight to the answer is no, they're not the same. When we eat emotionally, we're eating in response to our emotions, and we often stop eating when we're full or when we feel better emotionally. So, you could eat emotionally for a few days until, let's say, for example, you get over that breakup and you feel much better after using food to help you cope with the sadness. You might have been eating a tub of ice cream whilst watching TV for a few days or a week. But then, after you get through that breakup, then usually the emotional eating episodes stop. But when we binge eat, there is usually no end goal to when it can stop. We usually have no control over how much we eat and can find it very difficult to stop binge eating. Sometimes people can even eat past fullness until it physically hurts to eat anymore. So just as I touched earlier, unlike emotional eating, there is no end goal with binge eating, and you can binge for weeks on end, months on end, maybe even years on end. Either way, they can both be tough times to go through. But how can we clearly tell the difference between an emotional eating episode and a binge eating episode? Luckily, there is a clear set of criteria for binge eating. According to the DSM-5, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, a binge eating episode is characterized by eating in a certain period of time, wherein you tend to eat a larger amount of food than someone else in a similar circumstance. And you also have no sense of control over eating during this episode. It's as if you can't control yourself and you can't stop, as if you're almost on autopilot. Emotional eating doesn't have a clear set of criteria. It's something that is not globally defined, as it's very subjective for each person. So that means for one person eating the same amount of food, it may not seem like an emotional eating episode, but for another person, it may be an emotional eating episode. So after finding out the criteria for a binge eating episode, do you feel like you've gone through emotional eating or binge eating? But let's touch a little more on emotional eating, as most people who are struggling with it might see it as a problem in their lives. If you do feel that you're emotionally eating, it isn't something you should be ashamed of or feel guilty about. It is normal to eat emotionally. Yes, it's true that when we're sad, we tend to go to food for comfort, eating more than usual, like after a breakup, for example, or a very stressful day at work. But sadness isn't the only emotion. When we're happy, we also tend to eat more than usual, such as a birthday party, a wedding, or a celebration. When you're happy or excited, you're also emotionally eating. Emotional eating is completely normal. The moment when emotional eating can become an issue is when you feel so low that you only tend to go to food when you're sad or happy. If you find yourself only going to food in response to your emotions, and it is negatively affecting your health, then you may need to find other ways of coping with that issue. It could be trying to find a support group or finding another activity, such as working out or walking, for example. If you do feel that your emotional eating is a problem, let's try to take a step back and see what kind of foods you tend to eat. When you emotionally eat, what kind of foods do you tend to go for? So if you can, try to list down the foods you tend to emotionally eat. Now, try to take a look at that list and ask yourself honestly, are these the foods or the kinds of foods I allow myself to have throughout the day? Or do I tend to restrict them? I want you to check if you're genuinely having them regularly, not just as treats, but rather, you eat them when you're craving for them. Are you trying to avoid eating chocolates and crisps throughout the day as much as possible? But when you do emotionally eat, you find yourself heading straight to the chocolates and crisps. The reason for this is because our guard is down. And when we get emotional, our goals of trying to be quote unquote good or our goals of dieting is not a priority, but rather the main priority of our brain is to provide some comfort. I wonder that if you don't restrict these kinds of foods, would you still turn to them for comfort? If you have them regularly into your diet, they won't be seen as these special or forbidden foods that provide so much comfort when you're feeling sad, happy, or any other emotion. You wouldn't feel like you're treating yourself if you feel like you're having these foods regularly. Because by definition, a treat is something that you don't have regularly. These will just simply be like any other food in the house. These forbidden foods will become neutral foods. The second thing you can do to reduce emotional eating episodes is to recognize the difference between emotional hunger and physical hunger. I'd like you to ask yourself, am I actually genuinely hungry? Or am I looking to food to change how I feel? If you still aren't sure if you're hungry or not, because being on constant diets and skipping meals can affect the way we perceive our own hunger cues, you can check if you're feeling lightheaded or dizzy. You can also look at the last time you've eaten. Has it been around 4 hours or more since your last meal? Then if yes, it's likely that you may be physically hungry rather than emotionally hungry. But it is important to remember that you should be kind with yourself and non-judgmental. If you're still feeling hungry after eating your last meal an hour ago, then eat more. If you are certain that you're not physically hungry and you don't want to eat, but you want to have something to change how you feel, then that's a sure sign of emotional hunger. Emotional eating and physical hunger can overlap and come together. Have you ever felt hangry? And for those who don't know what hangry is, it's hungry and angry. You'll know that maybe after eating, you'll feel happy again, relaxed, or content. And I want you to know that it is normal to feel emotions before and after a meal. So I'll end this episode here, but I want to end this with a recap of emotional eating. I want you to know that it is okay to get comfort out of eating. It is completely okay to eat emotionally, and at some level, we're all emotional eaters. Emotional eating is not just eating when we're sad, but eating when we're happy, when we're excited. It is a wide range of emotions, and it's something to be enjoyed. When emotional eating starts to become a negative thing is when food becomes the only thing that we look to help us feel better. When we're going through a breakup, for example, when we only turn to food, then we may not get through that breakup very well, because food alone isn't going to heal your heartbreak. We need more than just one way of coping with stressful moments. Of course, a delicious meal to give you some comfort would be very helpful, but you also need a listening ear by speaking to a friend or a family member when we're stressed, or just having a support system, or taking part in hobbies you enjoy. If you've enjoyed this podcast, I would massively appreciate it if you rated this podcast well, if you feel like you've gained something out of this. If you're struggling with binge eating or emotional eating, and you're listening to this podcast, I offer one-to-one private coaching for men and women. And if you're unsure about this, I'm very happy to speak to you in our 15-minute free, non-obligatory discovery call, where we can get to know each other a little more and see how we can work together. The link to the discovery call is here in the description of the podcast. So, thank you once again for listening, and I'll see you next time. If you found this podcast helpful, you would definitely benefit from my binge eating freedom course in my website, bingedietitian.com. Learn more about the triggers to why you're binge eating and how to stop binge eating for good. No more food guilt, no more jumping from diet to diet, and no more shame. Go to the link in this episode for my binge eating freedom course to be one step closer to being binge free, starting today.